So boxing is a lot more dangerous than mixed martial arts fighting. And why do you ask? Usually, if you ask a casual, what do you think is a lot more dangerous? Is it MMA or boxing? Usually, they're going to tell you MMA because of the fact that, let's just be honest, it's a little bit more dynamic. It has more weapons that can be used. And because of that, somehow it seems like the sport that will damage you more. Well, I gotta tell you, the only thing that's really damaging about MMA, aside from the damage that you will take in the head in a similar fashion that you do in boxing, are the joints that you're gonna have to try to rehab over the years because of all the damage, wear and tear that you have to do with the grappling, with the jiu-jitsu, with the wrestling, with the constant explosion, as opposed to boxing, where, yes, it is more of an aerobic sport as compared to MMA, which is an anaerobic sport, but the reality is that boxing is a lot more dangerous because of the head trauma that you can receive. So because of that, Francis Ngannou has to ask himself a very firm question. Number one, he has to ask himself, is he going to be a full-time MMA fighter after this, or is this just one of those once-in-a-lifetime money-changing opportunities that is going to catapult him and his family's life in another stratosphere, as opposed to, let's say, continuing to dominate the MMA world, which, quite frankly, in my opinion, he already has, with the exception of perhaps fighting John Jones in his current prime at this current time of the landscape of the UFC, which has changed ever since he had left and been stripped because of the contract negotiations that he wasn't able to come to terms with Francis Ngannou in the UFC. So fast forward to 2023 of October going into November. The UFC is now planning on doing shows in Saudi Arabia. Now, who's paying Francis Ngannou and Tyson Fury for this upcoming matchup next week? None other than the Saudi government. Now, why is that really interesting? Because you know what? They could have almost just waited for Mohammed bin Salman to come together with, let's say, Francis Ngannou and Dana White and say, you know what? How much do you need? What do you want? You want insurance for the fighters? No big deal. We have the best medical team on the planet that we can provide with the oil money. The problem is, it was a little too late. Just like what I had mentioned with PBC Boxing in the previous video. But in this particular video, I want to tell you something about Francis Ngannou that I think he really has to come to a full warning with in terms of what he's going to do with the rest of his career, because he's a novice stepping into the boxing realm against one of the biggest and skilled boxers of all time, unarguably, in Tyson Fury. So he's going to be affected by the amount of damages that he's going to take in this fight in retrospect to his mixed martial arts career that he wants to perhaps continue and perhaps build a legacy after being stripped of the UFC title and now as the lineal heavyweight champion going into the PFL. So I think what's really important to understand is that Francis Ngannou has to take a look at the past fighters, and what I mean by past fighters, I'm talking about none other than the notorious Conor McGregor. Why? Because he was the guy that did exactly what Francis wanted to do. A sitting heavyweight or undisputed champion at the weight class he was at, two at that, 145 and 155, and Francis Ngannou in the heavyweight. He can compare and contrast what is going to happen to him in his career in the future down the line. Because I can tell you that with Conor, to really put it plain and simple after a long-winded explanation, boxing has damaged his career. So you got to think, what is the evidence that I have of that? Because I'm not just going to talk and say things without any proper evidence. And to be quite honest with you, I don't even know if it's evidence or not. But after the Floyd fight, he took on Khabib. Nobody has ever been able to outstrike McGregor Even Floyd had said it on the way up to the fight. McGregor has only lost by submission. He's never gotten his butt whooped standing up. Okay? Now, he finally gets his butt whooped standing up in a boxing match in his debut against the greatest of all time, just like Francis Ngannou has taken on the greatest of all time with none other than Tyson Fury. Okay? And then he goes into the Khabib fight, a guy who's not really the best striker of all time in MMA, at least not in comparison to Conor McGregor at the time, goes and hits him with an overhand right and knocks him down. I don't even think Floyd Mayweather had knocked him down. He basically rocked him on the feet and finished him off with a standing TKO, as opposed to Khabib, where he did knock him down with that overhand right in their 155 Undisputed Championship fight as he came back as none other than the lineal 155 champion, and Khabib already crowned as the Undisputed Champion based on the fact that he was able to take the belt in a vacancy against Al Iaquinta in last-minute circumstances, just like what Islam Makhachev and Volkanovski and Khamzat Chimaev and Usman are dealing with in UFC 284. So, a lot of things to consider for Francis Ngannou. I really think that he has to take into consideration the damage that he's going to take and what is that going to affect him going into the rest of his MMA career in relationship to what Tyson Fury could do to him. A lot of people look at this as like, well, Tyson Fury is the less of the powerful puncher and Francis Ngannou is more of the powerful puncher, but you got to understand this as a professional boxer and the best at that. Tyson Fury is the best puncher of them all. So the amount of damage that he's going to give to Francis Ngannou could potentially be life-changing. And let me tell you guys something from what I've started in the beginning of the video. Boxing is way more dangerous than MMA, because if you knock somebody's head in an MMA, even if it was with your shins from a head kick, including the multiple punches that you're going to throw at your opponent, you can still defend yourself with clinches, and there's not going to be a referee that's going to break you up. You can defend yourself with a takedown if your takedowns are efficient enough to be able to drag your opponent to the ground, whether it was through a timed shot, single or double leg, or whether it was a good methodical trip from a clinch position that you learned in judo from the time you were a kid. Nonetheless, it's a very protective sport with the type of damage that you take, as opposed to, you look at Ray Boom Boom Mancini, who defeated a Korean fighter back in the 1980s and basically ended his life in the ring, and among others that have their lives ended in the ring through the boxing rules. While the MMA guys are out there calling boxing this princess sport of cherry pickers, you got to understand there's a dark underbelly to this sport that can affect not only the boxer themselves, the full-time guys that are just doing this for that one particular career, but also for the MMA guys that are stepping in, just like Francis Ngannou with his debut at such a novice level, taking on the lineal undisputed champion of the world. I mean, really, he's not undisputed Tyson Fury, but let's really call it what it is. He's had all the belts, and undisputed or not, a lot of those are just politics and the time frame of when fights happen as in relationship to when they don't, and the opportunities that come and the opportunities that go as a result of it. But he's still way more experienced than Francis Ngannou, and you got to understand this is a very dangerous fight for him. So for Francis Ngannou to go in here, he really has to ask himself, what is worth more, my MMA career or the bag? But right now, either way, he could be the one getting the bag, taking over boxing, and never getting a scratch out of this at all. But the reality is that sometimes we understand there's boxers, there's MMA fighters, and then there's world-class undisputed level boxers. Because that's literally, if Francis Ngannou is not fighting Tyson Fury, he would be fighting for the Undisputed Championship right now. And he already touched all the belts. WBO, WBA, WBC, current one right now, IBF, the Ring Championship. And then on top of that, he has a chance to go fight Usyk, a guy who had all his belts that he was stripped from in 2015, so he's undisputed level. And Francis Ngannou is a novice going in here. But once again, this is why they call it what? The theater of the unknown. It would be the greatest upset of all time. That's why we're watching it. That's why all the boxing people that are in their high horse about this particular topic are still going to watch it, because guess what? The one thing that sells in combat sports is the theater of the unknown. What you think is going to happen may not happen, and what you think is going to happen may somehow perceive you to look like the most smart guy in a room. And sometimes the predictions that you make is going to make you look like the least intelligent guy in a room. But the reality is none of you really know, because the only one that really knows are the guys that are going in there. Tyson Fury, who understands that he is the best in the world, but can easily underestimate Francis Ngannou. And Francis Ngannou, who can easily underestimate what it is that he has going on in this particular niche matchup of a Queensberry boxing rules that requires a lot of different skills that sometimes may not be transferable from the MMA skill set, especially if your skill set is just throwing bombs all day. And then you got Mike Tyson in this whole entire fiasco, adding himself into the situation like he was Rocky training Creed. Maybe one day he was just watching, hitting a blunt, getting high, watching this film, thinking to himself, you know what? Maybe I could do what Rocky does. But the reality of this whole scope is that in order to be a top-level trainer, sometimes being a top-level fighter and having a top-level fighter experience is not what it's all cracked up to be. Because sometimes fighters, as we mentioned in previous podcasts, and the one that I did with Zayn Musa Boxing Dosage, is that your ego can sometimes get the best of you as a coach. And you got to ask yourself, is Mike Tyson just in it for the ego? Or he's still in it for the ego, but understands that there's an opportunity where this beast of a man, highly talented, naturally strong individual in Francis Ngannou could pull off an upset and perhaps attach himself into that name. And then if it goes into a disastrous route, as what most are predicting in the pugilist aspects of boxing, well then it just all looks negligent and it just all looks like a waste other than just the bag that he's going to get out of it. So don't forget to like and subscribe, because whether you got a high horse for this particular matchup or whether you're excited about it in a positive way, either way, I think the whole world is going to watch, and there is no denying of it. But there is also no denying of the domination that the Arab oligarchs and sheikhs and the royal families of this particular region are just dominating the sports in different venues and in different ways of creating tourism for their particular region. Because this week you got UFC 284 with Islam Makhachev taking on Volkanovski for the second time. The rematch from UFC 284 now going into UFC 294. And in a week after that, you got Francis Ngannou trying to shock the world against Tyson Fury. But is it worth the squeeze? Come find out. And don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you guys again, inshallah.